I had been dreaming about this day for months. Holding the keys to my new house in my hand felt like holding a little piece of freedom, a slice of peace I could finally call my own. The moving truck had just left, and I was standing in front of my front door, breathing in the crisp air of the neighborhood, thinking maybe, just maybe, this was going to be quiet. I imagined myself sitting on the porch, sipping coffee, listening to birds, not having to answer to anyone. It felt good, too good maybe, because as I was about to step inside, a sleek black SUV rolled slowly down the street. And then I saw her, Karen. Everyone in the neighborhood had warned me about her, of course. She had a reputation that could fill a whole YouTube channel, the self-appointed queen of rules, fines, and neighborhood patrols. And there she was, sunglasses perched on her nose, eyes locked on me like a hawk spotting its prey. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, she didn't even slow down. Well, maybe a little. She slowed down just enough to make sure I saw her glaring. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. Relax, I told myself. It's just a look, it can't hurt you. But I had that sinking feeling that this woman wasn't going to let me settle in quietly. I stepped into the yard, trying to appear busy with unpacking boxes, but she parked at the corner of the street, arms crossed, and watched like a human security camera. As I carried the first box inside, I thought, maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe she's just vigilant. Maybe this neighborhood is really as perfect and safe as the flyers promised. But then I heard it, the muttered words just loud enough to carry. I run this neighborhood. My stomach dropped. I froze for a second, thinking, did she really just say that? And then, just like that, she drove off slowly, leaving me to unpack in peace, or so I hoped. Once inside, I started surveying the place. It was perfect, really spacious kitchen, big windows letting in the morning light, a backyard that sloped gently down to a little wooded area behind the house. I felt that thrill of ownership, the kind that makes you feel like you've conquered a tiny piece of the world. But every time I glanced out the window, I half expected to see Karen peeking from her SUV again, her glare burning through the glass. I spent the afternoon moving boxes, arranging furniture, and imagining what life would be like here. And then it hit me, the locks. The old, scratched, outdated locks on the doors. I had planned to replace them eventually, but seeing them now, I knew I couldn't wait. Not in this neighborhood. If anyone tried to test me, or worse, Karen decided to assert her authority, I wanted to make sure my home was secure. So, armed with a screwdriver, new locks, and a YouTube tutorial on DIY lock installation, I set to work. At first, it was straightforward. The old locks came out with a few twists and turns, some mild cursing, and a lot of squinting. But halfway through, I dropped a screw under the fridge and spent 10 minutes fishing it out, muttering to myself about how I should have hired a professional. By the time I finished installing the first new lock, I felt a mix of triumph and exhaustion. And then I saw her again, Karen, standing outside my window, arms crossed, the same piercing glare. My first thought was, maybe she's just checking in. My second thought, much faster, she's going to lose it when she sees I didn't ask for her approval. She stormed up to my door, flapping her HOA binder like it was a weapon. "You can't just change the locks," she barked, and I realized instantly this woman was serious. She wasn't joking. She believed, fully and completely, that she had a say in what I did in my own home. I tried to explain calmly but firmly that I owned the house, the locks belonged to me, and I had every right to change them. Karen didn't listen. She went on about rules, community standards, and what she would allow. I nodded politely, thinking, this is ridiculous, but I can't let her see me sweat. I was beginning to understand that living here meant more than just enjoying a quiet neighborhood. It meant dealing with Karen. And then she did something I never expected. She pulled out her phone and started dialing. That's when I knew this wasn't going to be just another petty argument about locks. Karen was calling in backup, and somehow, I had a feeling that the authorities were about to get involved in what I thought was just a simple home improvement project. I froze for a moment as I watched Karen pull out her phone. My mind raced. Did she really just pull out her phone to call someone over my locks? Was this the part where my peaceful new life turned into some sort of neighborhood soap opera? I tried to step outside, figuring maybe if I talked to her directly, I could diffuse whatever storm was brewing. "You can't just change the locks," she said again, as if repetition would make it true. It's against HOA rules and I have to report it. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. These are my locks. I own this house. I'm allowed to secure my own doors. This isn't community property, it's not shared, it's mine. She shook her head vigorously, her binder slapping against her side with every motion. You have to get approval first. Everyone follows the rules, and you will too. I couldn't help it, I laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a full-on, are you serious, laugh. Approval, Karen, I didn't know my locks needed a town council vote. This is my house. Her eyes narrowed, and for a second I thought she might scream. Instead, she held the phone closer to her ear, and I realized she wasn't just angry. She was calling 911. I backed up slightly, hands raised in mock surrender, thinking maybe if I stay calm, this will blow over. Okay, Karen. Let me guess, you're telling them I'm breaking the law. She gave me a smug little nod and muttered something to the dispatcher, loud enough for me to hear. Yes, my neighbor is tampering with HOA property and possibly committing a crime. I blinked. HOA property. My locks. The audacity was almost comical. I wanted to laugh, but I also felt a pulse of panic. What if she actually convinced someone that this was illegal? What if officers showed up and thought I was some kind of criminal mastermind because Karen decided she runs this neighborhood? Trying to stay in control, I pulled out my phone and started snapping photos of the new locks and the old ones I had removed. I figured evidence couldn't hurt. Maybe if the police asked questions, I could show them the receipts and the deed to prove this was my property. While I was doing this, Karen kept packing, glancing at the window, muttering to herself about community standards and safety risks. I had a sudden thought. Maybe she really does see herself as a protector of the streets. Only, instead of protecting, she was just controlling, and I was the target. After a few minutes, I decided to speak to her directly, even though I knew it would be tense. Karen, I said, do you understand that this is my home, my locks? I'm not doing anything illegal. This isn't some HOA rule violation, it's basic property rights. She waved her hand dismissively. Property rights? Don't make me laugh, you're still part of this community. You will follow the rules, and if you don't, I will escalate this. I felt my jaw tighten. Escalate? How much further could this go? I glanced at the phone in her hand. I had no idea how long it would take for anyone to arrive, and I knew the suspense was just beginning. Part of me wanted to run inside, lock myself behind my doors, and hope this passed. But another part of me thought, no, I wasn't going to let her intimidate me in my own house. I continued working on the other locks, trying to act like nothing was happening, even though Karen was practically vibrating with outrage beside me. I tightened the last screw and stepped back, taking a breath. The sun glinted off the shiny new lock, and for a moment I felt victorious. But then I realized something. Karen was still watching, still plotting. I could feel her judgment like a weight pressing down on me, and I knew this confrontation was far from over. I even caught myself thinking about the irony. I moved here for peace and quiet, for a new start, and already I was in the middle of a neighborhood showdown over locks. Who calls 911 over locks? Apparently, Karen does. By the time I finished installing the locks, the suspense was unbearable. Every little noise outside made me glance over my shoulder. A bird landing on the fence felt like an intruder. Every passing car made me flinch. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that when the police arrived, this was going to escalate even further. The calm, quiet life I had imagined for myself was already gone, replaced by a very real battle with the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. I stepped back, inspected my work, and muttered to myself, well, Karen, if this is war, I guess I'm ready. I hadn't expected the 911 call to escalate so quickly, but within what felt like 10 minutes, I heard the faint rumble of sirens approaching. My heart started pounding. I glanced at Karen, who was now practically bouncing on the balls of her feet like a drill sergeant ready for inspection. Her eyes were locked on the street, as if she'd single-handedly summoned the entire police force. When the patrol car pulled up, I could barely hold back a sarcastic laugh. I mean, really? Police over a few locks. I opened the door, trying to look calm and reasonable, because deep down I knew that if they got even a whiff of Karen's version of events, things could get messy. "Good afternoon," one of the officers said, stepping out and approaching me. "We received a call about a possible property violation." Karen didn't waste a second. She practically lunged forward. "Yes, he is tampering with HOA property, installing locks without permission. It's a clear violation." I blinked. "HOA property, my locks," I wanted to facepalm. "Officers, I own this house. These locks are mine. I installed them on my doors. There is no HOA ownership of my property. This is my home." The officers exchanged glances. I could see the doubt in their eyes, the unspoken question, "Who do you believe in a suburban war over locks?" One officer asked for documentation. I quickly pulled out the deed, showing the proof of ownership, and handed over the receipts for the new locks. The paper felt heavy in my hands, like armor against Karen's accusations. Karen wasn't done. She waved her HOA binder at the officers. "You have to understand, he thinks he can just do whatever he wants. It's about maintaining the standards of our community." I resisted the urge to laugh out loud. Standards? Really? Installing a proper lock on my door was somehow a crime against civilization. "I understand you want standards," I said, trying to stay calm. "But property rights come first. I own this house. These locks are legal. You can check the documentation." The officers nodded, flipping through the papers. Karen huffed, muttering under her breath about rogue homeowners and how no one respects the rules anymore. I could practically hear her wheels turning, calculating her next move. One officer finally spoke up. "Ma'am, this seems like a civil matter. The homeowner has documentation proving ownership. As long as no laws are being broken, there's nothing for us to act on." I felt a rush of relief. Victory, at least temporary. I tried to give Karen a small smile, thinking maybe this was over. But of course, Karen doesn't do over. She crossed her arms, glaring at me like she'd just been slapped in the face with reality. "Temporary," I muttered to myself, because I knew this wasn't going to stop her. Karen had built her reputation on persistence, on obsessing over rules, no matter how absurd. This was her playground, and I had just dared to play by my own rules. I started thinking back over the past hour, how surreal it had been. Moving into a quiet neighborhood, unpacking boxes, changing locks, and now standing in the middle of a full-blown HOA confrontation with law enforcement on standby. It felt like a sitcom, only with more tension and less laugh track. Karen, of course, tried one last angle. "You'll see, I have ways to make him comply. You haven't seen the end of this." The officers finally started packing up, giving her a polite warning about unnecessary 911 calls. She muttered and stomped back to her SUV, but I could see the fury in her eyes. She wasn't defeated, she was plotting. I knew this confrontation was just the first round. As I closed the door behind me, I took a deep breath and tried to shake off the adrenaline. I felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. I had stood my ground, provided evidence, and survived Karen's attack, but I also knew the war had only begun. For the first time, I realized moving into this neighborhood wasn't just about enjoying a peaceful home. It was about navigating Karen's obsession, her sense of control, and the absurd rules she enforced with surgical precision. Every glance from her, every car passing by, could become another battle. And so I sat down, finally letting my body relax, but my mind kept spinning. I could almost hear Karen muttering to herself about her next move. I knew that in the coming days, she'd escalate, and the suspense was going to grow. This wasn't just a story about locks anymore. It was a full-blown HOA showdown, and I was right in the center of it. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the new locks on my door. For now, I had one, but I knew better than to get comfortable. Karen was out there, somewhere, already scheming her next move, and I had a feeling that the calm, peaceful life I imagined when I got the keys would have to wait. I thought the police visit would mark the end of the chaos, but Karen clearly had other plans. The next morning, I stepped outside to assess my yard, and predictably, there she was, standing across the street, arms crossed, sunglasses on, muttering to herself like she was rehearsing a courtroom speech. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that today was about settling in, not feeding her obsession. I started organizing boxes in the garage, trying to tune her out, when the sound of tires crunching on gravel made me pause. My heart sank. Another car, surely not more police. But yes, it was the HOA patrol, or more accurately, Karen's personal army. 2 more officers were walking toward me, clipboards in hand. I tried to mask my frustration with a polite smile. "Good morning," one of them said. "We received follow-up calls regarding the locks." Karen didn't waste a second. She practically charged up the driveway, waving her binder like a banner of authority. "See, they won't listen to reason. He continues to violate community rules." I could feel my patience thinning. "Officers, I already showed you all the documents yesterday. This house is mine, these locks are mine, and nothing illegal is happening here. There's no HOA property being tampered with." Karen scoffed. "Property rights? Ha, you're ignoring the standards of the neighborhood, which we all must follow." I tried not to laugh out loud. Standards? She was acting like installing a lock on your own front door was a crime against humanity. I had to remind myself that this wasn't a joke, that the tension was real, and that Karen was capable of escalating this further. The officers asked for documentation again, clearly caught between 2 very different versions of reality. I handed over the deed, the receipts, even photos of the new locks installed. The paper in my hand felt like armor against the absurdity surrounding me. Karen muttered something under her breath about rogue homeowners and discipline, but I ignored it. Then she did something I hadn't anticipated. She called over 2 neighbors to back her up. At first I thought, fine, maybe they can clarify things. But no, they were nodding along, whispering agreement, validating her claims in subtle ways. My stomach sank. This was starting to feel like a neighborhood coup. "Why are you letting her do this?" I asked one of the neighbors, trying to sound casual. "This is my house." They gave me awkward glances and muttered something about keeping the peace. I realized then that not everyone had the courage or the energy to confront Karen, and that the HOA queen had quietly amassed influence through fear and politeness. I took a deep breath. I wasn't going to let her intimidate me. "I appreciate your concern, but I own this property. These locks are legal. There's nothing here that breaks any law." Karen stomped her foot, clearly frustrated that I refused to back down. "You'll see. You think you can just ignore the rules, but this isn't over. I will make sure you comply." I could feel the suspense tightening around me. Every glance from Karen, every whisper from the neighbors, made it clear this wasn't just about locks anymore. It was about control, power, and ego, and I had just stepped into the middle of her personal war. After what felt like an eternity, the officers finally started to pack up, giving Karen polite warnings about unnecessary calls. She muttered, waved her binder one last time, and stormed off, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind. She wasn't defeated, she was plotting. I stood there, exhausted but resolute. Changing the locks had seemed like a simple home improvement project, a practical step to secure my house. Instead, it had become a full-blown HOA standoff, and I knew, deep down, that Karen's obsession was far from over. I closed the door, leaned against it, and let out a long sigh. For a moment, I tried to imagine the calm life I had hoped for when I got the keys, but it was gone, replaced by a constant, simmering tension. Karen was out there, scheming. Neighbors were quietly watching, and I was in the middle, trying to survive her obsession with authority. The suspense was unbearable, but I couldn't let it control me. I reminded myself that I had the facts on my side. I had the documentation, and I had the locks. For now, that was enough. But I knew I had to be ready. Karen wasn't just an annoying neighbor, she was a strategist, and this battle was far from over. As I finally sat down with a cup of coffee, I glanced at the door. The shiny new lock gleamed in the sunlight. It was more than a piece of metal, it was a symbol. a symbol of control, ownership, and for now, a small victory. But deep down, I knew that every small victory in this neighborhood came with the constant fear of Karen finding a way to escalate. And that's when I realized that living here wasn't just about enjoying a house. It was about navigating the chaos that came with Karen's obsession. By the time the officers left and Karen finally stomped back to her SUV, I thought I could finally breathe. I thought I could maybe unpack a little more, get a cup of coffee, and feel a sense of normalcy returning. But no. Karen had made it clear that this wasn't about locks anymore, it was about control. And control, I was discovering, she took very seriously. Over the next few days, it became apparent just how deep her obsession ran. I started noticing little things. Notes left on my doorstep, neatly typed and folded, reminding me of community standards. A neighbor stopped by, whispering that Karen had been inspecting everyone's mailboxes earlier that morning. Another mentioned that she'd find someone for a Halloween decoration last year. And there I was, standing in the middle of this perfect-looking neighborhood, realizing that under the surface, it was a battlefield, and Karen was the general. I started to piece together her history. Apparently, she had been running the HOA for over a decade. She knew everyone's schedules, their habits, and most importantly, their fears. She had a reputation for enforcing rules that were sometimes so petty you could barely believe it. Flower heights, mailbox paint color, how many rocks you could have in your garden. Everything was monitored. Everything was judged. And now, apparently, locks were a major offense. I tried to keep my humor intact. I told myself, at least she's consistent. But it was hard to laugh when I kept finding little sticky notes on my door. Reminder, HOA approved colors only, or community safety notice. Verify your outdoor lighting. It was like living under a microscope, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was always watching, always judging. Then came the whispers from the neighbors. Some were clearly terrified to get involved, nodding politely when Karen walked by. Others, I realized, secretly hated her just as much as I did. One neighbor confided, "You're braver than anyone else here. I've tried to stand up to her before, it's exhausting." Another whispered, "Don't worry, we've all seen what she does. You're not alone, but she's relentless." Their small admissions were comforting, but they also reminded me just how much influence she had. This wasn't just a one-on-one conflict. It was a neighborhood chess game, and I was just learning the rules. Karen, of course, seemed to thrive on this tension. Every time I stepped outside, she appeared, either packing, watching, or muttering about keeping everyone in line. I started noticing how she used the 911 calls almost like a weapon, an intimidation tactic to remind everyone that she was always paying attention, always ready to intervene. The suspense of not knowing when she would strike again kept me on edge. Every time my phone buzzed, I flinched, half expecting a message from her threatening a rule violation report. I also began to notice her strategy. She wasn't just yelling or calling authorities, she was planting seeds. She would mention rules casually, drop hints about inspections, or stand at the mailbox and mutter to anyone who walked by. It was psychological warfare, and she was a master. She wanted everyone in the neighborhood to second-guess themselves, to walk on eggshells, and I was learning that she saw me as a threat because I refused to play along. I couldn't let this go on. I had to figure out how to navigate Karen's obsession without letting it overwhelm me. I started keeping meticulous records. Every interaction, every note, every minor confrontation. I photographed my property, my locks, my mailbox, anything she might claim violated her invisible rules. I realized that living here wasn't just about enjoying a house anymore. It was about protecting myself from an endless stream of petty, obsessive attacks. And yet, even with all the stress, I couldn't help but marvel at how absurd the situation was. Who calls 911 over a lock? Who spends hours monitoring a mailbox? Who turns a quiet neighborhood into a battlefield over rules that barely matter? And somehow, in the middle of this chaos, I felt a tiny spark of determination. Karen might think she ruled this neighborhood, but I wasn't about to let her intimidate me. The suspense grew every day. Every time I saw her car in the driveway, every time a neighbor whispered about a new rule, my heart would race. But at the same time, I was learning how to fight back, not with anger, not with yelling, but with patience, evidence, and a clear understanding of my rights. Karen might have the personality of a neighborhood dictator, but I had the law, the truth, and slowly but surely, allies who were tired of her reign. By the end of the week, I realized something important. This wasn't just about locks. It was about standing my ground in a place where one woman believed she could control everything, and I had made the decision that I wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. By the time I woke up the next morning, I knew it was time to stop letting Karen dictate my life. She had made it painfully clear that she saw herself as the ruler of the neighborhood, and while some neighbors avoided her wrath, I wasn't about to hide. I brewed a cup of coffee, stared at my shiny new locks, and made a mental note. Today, I would stand my ground. It wasn't easy. Karen had perfected the art of intimidation. She would appear at the exact moment you let your guard down, or send passive-aggressive notes in perfect cursive that made you question if you'd done something wrong without even realizing it. But I was done tiptoeing. My house, my rules, my locks. I stepped outside, surveying the yard like a general preparing for battle. Sure enough, Karen was already there, packing. Arms crossed, sunglasses on, muttering about rules and community standards. She looked like she'd been waiting all night for the perfect confrontation. I braced myself. "Good morning, Karen," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." She narrowed her eyes. "Oh, I'm listening," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You continue to ignore the rules and I will escalate. Do you understand?" "I understand," I replied evenly. "But I also understand my rights. These locks are mine, I own this house, there is no law being broken." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment I thought she might explode. But instead, she tried another tactic: gaslighting. "You think ownership gives you freedom to act however you want. You're wrong. The community comes first, always." I let out a short laugh, trying to mask the rising tension. The community doesn't own my locks. The community doesn't own my doors. I can't make this any clearer. Her eyes flashed. "You will see what happens when you defy me." And then it happened. A neighbor who had been quietly watching from across the street stepped forward. She gave Karen a pointed look and said, "Maybe you should back off. He's following the law, that's what matters." Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she pivoted and tried to play the sympathy card, turning to the officers who had lingered nearby from previous visits. "This is about safety," she said, "and he's putting the neighborhood at risk." I felt my patience snapping, but I forced myself to stay calm. Safety? Locks I own and installed on my property are a threat to safety. That's absurd. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to handle a situation where a neighbor was acting more like a vigilante than a community leader. I handed them copies of my deed and receipts again, even though I knew they already had them. This wasn't just about documentation, it was about proving that I wasn't going to be bullied. Karen, realizing she couldn't sway anyone this time, muttered under her breath and stomped off to her SUV. But I knew better than to celebrate too soon. She wasn't defeated, she was simmering, already plotting her next move. I couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. Here I was, standing in my own yard, trying to defend something as simple as locks from a woman who seemed determined to control everyone's life. It was ridiculous. It was exhausting. And it was terrifyingly suspenseful. Every glance from Karen, every footstep she took, kept me on edge, reminding me that peace in this neighborhood was a fragile illusion. But standing my ground gave me a strange sense of empowerment. I realized that Karen's tactics only worked if you let them. By staying calm, presenting facts, and refusing to be intimidated, I had already won small victories. And while she might continue to try to escalate, I was learning that patience, preparation, and persistence were my best weapons. I went inside, sat down, and looked at my locks. For a moment, they felt more than just security devices. They were symbols of my determination, my resolve, and my refusal to let a self-proclaimed HOA queen control my life. The suspense wasn't gone. In fact, it was building. Karen had plans, I was sure of it. but for now, I could breathe. I made a mental note. Next time she tried to escalate, I would be ready. Not with anger, but with calm confidence, evidence, and an unwavering sense of my rights. Karen might think she ran this neighborhood, but she had no idea I wasn't going anywhere. And deep down, a tiny part of me couldn't help but grin. This was far from over, but for the first time, I felt like I was no longer the victim of her obsession. I was a player in this game, and the stakes had never been higher. By the middle of the week, it became clear that Karen wasn't going to give up. Every morning, she appeared in her usual spot across the street, arms crossed, scanning the neighborhood like a hawk searching for prey. At first, I thought her behavior was just annoying. But now, I realized it was strategic. She was testing me, waiting for a mistake, hoping I'd crack under the pressure. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, as I was taking out the trash, I noticed a couple of neighbors whispering across the street. They weren't looking at Karen. They were looking at me. My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea what they were thinking. Were they going to side with her, or were they silently approving my defiance? One of them, a woman who lived 2 houses down, stepped closer. She lowered her voice so Karen couldn't hear and said, "Honestly, most of us are tired of her antics. You're brave for standing up to her." I blinked, surprised. "Really?" I asked, trying not to let my excitement show. "You mean I'm not alone?" She nodded. "Karen's scary, yes, but you're in the right. You're not breaking any rules. Some of us just don't have the guts to say it out loud." That moment was like a spark lighting a fuse. For the first time, I realized that Karen's power wasn't absolute. Sure, she had intimidation, a reputation, and a knack for surveillance. But she relied on fear, not facts. And now, people were starting to see that. Of course, Karen wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. Later that day, I noticed her packing in her driveway, muttering into her phone. She was calling someone, probably plotting her next move. The suspense was suffocating. I didn't know what she had planned, but I knew it wouldn't be small. By evening, she tried to rally a few neighbors to her side, knocking on doors and insisting that everyone comply with her rules. I could see the reactions from across the street. Some shook their heads, others muttered polite refusals. She was starting to realize her influence was slipping, and the fury in her eyes was unmistakable. I stayed inside, listening to the subtle tension outside. Every creak in the floorboards, every sound from the street, made me flinch. Karen's obsession wasn't just about me anymore, it had become a neighborhood spectacle. And the suspense of not knowing when or how she'd escalate next kept me on edge. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, jotting down everything that had happened. The calls, the confrontations, the whispered support from neighbors. It was like preparing for battle, keeping a record in case she tried to take it further. And I realized, as absurd as it felt, that living in this neighborhood had become a high-stakes game of strategy. Every move mattered. Every word counted. Then came the twist. Karen, desperate to regain control, decided to escalate the situation legally. She submitted a formal complaint to the HOA board, claiming I had violated community rules by changing my locks without proper approval. I knew this could have gone either way. The suspense was unbearable. If the board sided with her, it would set a precedent that could affect every homeowner. But if they didn't, it would expose her overreach for everyone to see. I spent the next few days preparing. I gathered all documentation, the deed to my property, receipts for the locks, photos of the installation process, and records of every interaction with Karen. I also quietly reached out to neighbors who had witnessed her behavior, asking if they would support me if needed. Slowly, allies emerged, people who were tired of Karen's obsession and ready to back me up. The night before the board meeting, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every encounter, imagining every possible outcome. The suspense was almost unbearable. I knew Karen would be there, probably ready to launch into a tirade. But I also knew I had facts, evidence, and quietly loyal neighbors on my side. By the morning of the meeting, my nerves were a mix of adrenaline, anticipation, and a little bit of fear. I was about to confront Karen not just in my yard, but in a formal setting where the entire neighborhood would watch. and for the first time, I felt like the underdog might actually have a chance. This was it, the stage was set. Karen thought she had the power, but I was ready. The suspense had been building for weeks, and now it was about to reach its climax. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing: I wasn't backing down. The morning of the HOA board meeting felt like walking onto a stage I hadn't auditioned for but somehow ended up starring in. I clutched my folder of documents like armor, feeling the weight of every encounter with Karen leading up to this moment. The conference room was buzzing with neighbors, a mix of curiosity and quiet tension in the air. And of course, Karen arrived like she owned the place, binder in hand, sunglasses on, ready to lay down the law. As soon as the meeting began, she jumped right in. This homeowner has flagrantly violated community rules. He has changed locks without approval, undermining the safety and order of our neighborhood. She waved her binder for dramatic effect, and a few murmurs rippled through the room. I took a deep breath, knowing this was my chance to turn the tables. "Good morning, everyone," I began calmly. "I'd like to present the facts." I opened my folder and laid out the documentation, the deed proving ownership, receipts for the locks, and photographs showing the installation process. I even included a timeline of Karen's previous interventions and unnecessary 911 calls, just enough to make people raise an eyebrow without turning it into a personal attack. The board members examined everything quietly, flipping through pages, nodding occasionally. Karen, on the other hand, was fuming. Her face was red, her hands gripping the binder like it was a lifeline. "This is absurd," she shouted. "You can't just ignore the rules." "I'm not ignoring the rules," I said evenly. "I'm following the law and protecting my property. Changing locks on my own house does not violate any HOA guidelines. Here are the facts." I gestured to the documents. "I've with every legal requirement. There's nothing to enforce here." A long silence filled the room. You could feel the suspense hanging in the air like a storm about to break. Karen leaned forward, trying to insert another argument, but the board chair raised a hand politely. "Ms. Karen, we've reviewed the documentation. The homeowner has presented sufficient proof of ownership and legality. There is no basis for any fines or penalties regarding the locks." Karen blinked as if the words themselves were an attack. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, struggling for a response. She stammered, "But the rules, the community standards." "I'm afraid community standards cannot override property rights," the chair said firmly. "Case dismissed." I couldn't help but feel a rush of triumph. It was a surreal mix of relief, exhilaration, and yes, a little bit of vindictive satisfaction. Karen sat there, stunned, realizing that her power over the neighborhood had limits. For the first time, I saw the human behind the intimidating, a woman caught off guard, exposed, and furious. After the meeting, neighbors came up to me quietly, some with smiles, some with awkward handshakes, but all conveying the same message. They were tired of Karen's obsession, and they were glad someone finally stood up. "We've all seen it," one whispered. "You did what no one else had the courage to do." Another nodded. Finally, someone proved it's okay to say no. Karen, of course, didn't leave quietly. She stormed out, muttering about how she would reassess the rules and take further action, but her words carried less weight now. Everyone had seen the documents, the logic, the evidence. Her influence was waning. That evening, as I returned home, I walked past my shiny new locks with a sense of pride. They weren't just metal and mechanisms anymore. They were symbols of standing my ground, of asserting my rights, and of surviving Karen's obsession. I felt a sense of calm settle over me that I hadn't experienced since moving in. For the first time, I could envision myself enjoying this house, my neighborhood, without constantly glancing over my shoulder. Karen might still be there, prowling and muttering, but I knew she couldn't stop me anymore. The suspense of daily confrontations was finally over, replaced by a sense of hard-earned peace. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set behind the trees, and thought about the absurdity of the past weeks. Locks, calls to 911, passive-aggressive notes, neighbors whispering, none of it made sense, and yet it had all led to this moment. Humor and drama had intertwined in ways I could never have imagined. I smiled, knowing one thing for certain. Karen might have called herself the queen of the neighborhood, but I had reclaimed my castle. And in the end, all it took was patience, evidence, and a refusal to be intimidated. Standing your ground, even against the most obsessive neighbor, can turn the tides in the most unexpected ways. As night fell, the house was finally quiet. My locks secure, my rights affirmed, and my sanity intact. For the first time since moving in, I truly felt at home. Karen might still think she runs the neighborhood, but I knew the truth. Sometimes, common sense and courage triumph over obsession and intimidation. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.